Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer fantasy lore. We've been in the cold, desolate wastes of Kislev for quite some time, so today we're going to have ourselves a change of scenery, and a drastic one at that, from the extreme north to the extreme south, where massive, near impenetrable jungles and oppressive heat is the norm, and we go down here to visit a very peculiar group of natives, the Savage Orcs. Now, I have talked a little bit about the Savage Orcs before in a Southlands video, but I feel the charming little ferals deserve a video all of their very own. For they are, in all due reality, nothing less than the very origins of the modern-day orc. Although, feral orcs are not a thing of the past, they still exist in pretty damn considerable quantities in the Southlands even to this day, for various reasons that we will be getting into later. But let us start way, way back in the green mists of time, long before the shattering of the dwarf kingdoms, and long, long before the rise of the human empire. All the way back then, there were already orcs, wandering through the jungles and hitting whatever they came across with heavy wooden clubs. This would generally result in 1 out of 3 scenarios. 1. The thing struck was a piece of wood, or a stone, or some other piece of the scenery. This could result in a brand new tool or weapon, the two are practically indistinct as far as orcs are concerned anyways, and the development of orc society on the micro level. For example, an orc might realize that if he were to put a heavy rock at the end of his large wooden trunk, then suddenly he would have an even more effective bashing stick. Some of the most highbrow of individuals within early feral orc society even figured out that certain rocks could be struck against other rocks to create sharp implements, allowing not merely for bashing, but also for stabbing. Another common scenario was that whatever was hit would let out a loud shriek, and then subsequently fall over, dead in all due likelihood. If not, then the orc would simply continue hitting until the desired result of death was achieved. Now, this in and of itself also opens up for some branching paths, certainly. For example, if the item murdered was made of meat, then the orc would then have something to fill his belly with on that particular evening. And if it also happened to be wearing fur at the time, well, that's clothing, because even the feral orcs have at least a certain sense of dignity. More due to Games Workshop marketing department and potential lawsuits, I suspect, than their own real need to wear any clothes or furs, but hey, details. Some animals could even be used for various other implements that could be combined with tools. Innards could be turned into bowstrings, for example, or used to wrap around sharp or heavy implements to attach them to pieces of wood. This is about as far as feral orc society ever advanced, really. And then, of course, there is the third outcome. Whatever the orc hit goes yelp, but in this particular scenario, the thing struck turns out to be considerably larger than the orc, and will then turn around rather miffed and step on the orc. And considering the size and girth of the local megafauna usually found in the deep, dark jungles of the Southlands, this would in all due likelihood lead to the demise of our beloved little orc. However, where there is one greenskin, you can usually be assured that there are considerably more greenskin. And so, a little primitive warg is launched. Though unlike the civilized sort, whose objectives can be, quite sophisticated by orc terms like burning a village or invading a nation or simply just crumping that other tribe over there. In the case of a feral orc warg, at least in this limited circumstance, it is merely a quest to figure out whether or not the thing that stepped on our comrade is 1. Made out of meat, 2. Killable, and 3. Poisonous. Preferably not poisonous. Yeah, poisonous creatures have their uses, absolutely, but poisoned weapons, that's more of a tool of filthy grots and Gretchen rather than true proud orcs, and whilst the orc metabolism is a mighty thing indeed that can digest mostly anything, again, the Southlands seem to specialize in creating a wide variety of species that make a mockery of even the orc asshole. For remember, children, the rule of the strong, that's for civilized folks. Out in the jungle, it's the rule of eat or be eaten, and that particular competition is not over until the defeated has passed all the way through the victor's digestive system and out his rectum, without the painful passing of the victor. This latter part also, by the way, applies to the smaller furry animals, the one that went squeak and then just simply died. The orcs will, of course, experiment by eating those things as well, because, well, they eat pretty much anything and everything they come across, so, why not? But over the course of, well, I was to say a couple of meals, if they were intelligent, but we're talking about orcs here, so over the course of a handful of decades or centuries, the tribe will slowly but surely learn that no, this particularly brightly coloured weasel is bad for eating, because it gives you the lethal taco shits. So yeah, as I'm sure you've already begun to gather, this environment is not exactly conducive to any sort of higher form of civilization or development at all, really, and unsurprisingly, no great civilizations ever sprung forth from the Southland jungles. The lizardmen don't count, by the way. They were there before there were jungles, being the prodigy of space aliens and all that nonsense. And to emphasize the hostility of the landscape, I would also like to point out that we are talking about orcs here. Now, normally, the mere existence of an orc, breathing, farting, burping, etc., will spread huge quantities of spores that will then begin infesting the local landscape, overwhelming and subsuming all but the hardiest examples of local flora, and then, soon, when the spores begin hatching into squigs and goblins and Gretchen, they quickly begin feeding upon the local fauna as well. In most cases, the only way of getting rid of an orc infestation is in the form of a massive, organized undertaking by whatever creatures live nearby with the capacity to actually undertake such levels of organization. That and the liberal application of fire. Every single spore needs to be burned and destroyed utterly. Every piece of flora that's been infected needs to be annihilated. All of the creatures, of course, the greenskins themselves, also needed to be hunted down and murdered, because their very existence will spread yet further spores. In many cases, the very soil itself would have to be turned over and regularly burned again, lest further spores, laying long dormant and buried in the top layer of soil, begin to sprout anew. To put it another way, completely eradicating an orc infestation is much the same as being asked to clean up after Chernobyl with a toothbrush. Your toothbrush, specifically. A nigh-on impossible, extraordinarily uncomfortable, and in all due likelihoods lethal endeavour. And yet all of this, orcs are a relative rarity in the Southlands. And far from being overrun with spores, the jungle looks much the same way it has always done. How can this be? Well, we'll return to the whole eat or be eaten idea. There is always a bigger and toothier feeding hole out there, attached to an even hardier and more robust sphincter, capable of turning even the meanest and greenest of orc along with his weapons and armor into just so much fertilizer. And as it happens, the Southlands are a home to a remarkable number of these bigger, toothier feeding holes. One might even begin to wonder how, on God Emperor's good glorious earth, the green little bastards even managed to survive in the feral hellhole that is their home in the first place. And, well, a great deal of it was probably luck and, well, good old-fashioned perseverance. Orcs have one advantage over pretty much every other intelligence, scratch that, every other race in existence. They are simply too dumb to know when to quit. And the fact they managed to stay alive in the green hell for as long as they did eventually opened up a great deal of brand new opportunities. And the first new horizon to unveil itself to the green-skinned savages bore a very large hat, and was rather stunty and snaggle-toothed, and wouldn't shut up about Hushut and flying cows. Yes, that is right, it is our beloved Dowie Zar, the Chaos Dwarves. They needed a lot of help to run their new forges, and the orcs seemed like prime candidates. Large, strong, relatively stupid and hardy, resistant to fire as well. All of these things are great benefits. There was one drawback which the Chaos Dwarves did not realize until it was honestly a little bit too late. They had underestimated just how hardy and how stupid the Orcs actually were. As it turns out, it is supremely difficult to chastise a creature that A, doesn't feel pain, and B, doesn't care about the threat of pain because it barely feels it anyways. And without the option of instilling discipline via the whoopish of the lash, slave populations can get somewhat unruly, as the Chaos Dwarves experienced to their detriment, as their nascent empire was almost wiped off the face of the earth during a massive greenskin uprising. The Chaos Dwarves were only saved by the fact that the Greenskin's baser nature being that of betrayal, the hobgoblins decided to turn against their green-skinned brethren in return for better serving conditions from the Chaos Dwarves. And whilst this sudden realignment of allegiances did save the Chaos Dwarf Empire and crush the rebellion, several Greenskins nevertheless managed to escape. Huge numbers of them flooded out of their prison cells and began dispersing through the wastelands, creating a great deal of work for the Chaos Dwarves in the future as well. And eventually, these tribes began reforming themselves, both in the wastelands and heading southwards and into the mountains. And they had learned much from their captors, including the art of metal crafting. This was quite the quantum leap from what the Orcs had been used to previously, which was of course crude and shoddy tools / weapons made out of wood, stone, and, on occasion, bones. The ability to now use crude iron choppers, whilst still not exactly artistically pleasing, was nevertheless quite the advancement both in terms of cutting power and in durability. And whilst these were the beginnings of the modern-day Orc tribes, which are capable of producing both armor and weapons to sufficient quality, shall we say, again, in the modern-day world where you have a sword wielded by a human or an effete elf, you have to kind of rely upon the sharpness of the blade to do a lot of the work, whereas in the hands of a massively muscled green-skinned monstrosity, it doesn't actually have to be that sharp. As long as it's heavy and has at least something that vaguely resembles a cutting edge, if in form, if nothing else, then that's usually good enough. And as for armor, well, again, whilst the more quick and effeminate races might require form and function, a rounded steel plate that is both light and durable, all the Orc really needs is a slab of metal with some leather straps, with which he can roughly affix it to his body. So again, whilst Orc metal crafting will not win a huge number of beauty pageants, it is nevertheless effective for the wearer. And slowly but surely, the freed slaves... rioting, rebelling slaves? When does a slave revolt stop being a revolt and start being, something else? I never thought I'd ask that question. Anywho, the ex-slaves eventually made their way back home once again, where they and their new-fangled toys were met with a solid green wall of concentrated skepticism. What was this nonsense? Metal mallets? Steel spears? What manner of absolute faggotry could this possibly be, then? Surely any Orc warrior worth his salt would be more than able to make up for any shortcomings in his weaponry with just good old-fashioned Orc brawn, right? And armor. What manner of poncy pacifist piss is that? Protecting yourself from the sharp implements, horns, teeth, and claws of your enemies? Truly, they just do not raise the young ones as they used to anymore. Weaklings, all of them. Who needs to be upholstered in metal just to hunt a mere saber-toothed tiger or a laser beam-wielding T-Rex? Now, true, there were those who were weak, those who were pathetic in physique, and embraced this new, effeminate form of warfare. And tragically, I must inform you that indeed it was not but a few, but the majority that decided that no, we don't actually want to wrestle Dilophosaurus's into the ground anymore and beat them to death with rocks. Instead, these pansies decided that they were far better off using metal implements to hunt and to raid their neighbors. And, well, in all due fairness, it did turn out to be a hell of a lot more effective than what the Orcs had been doing up until that point. And fortuitously as well, one of the main bottlenecks that had been keeping the Orcs from exploring the nearby territories, the human nation of Nehekhara, was having some troubles at that point in time, and would soon cease to be an impediment for adventurous Orcs, who could then spread across the world, bringing their culture of beat it harder, boy, to the rest of the planet. This export turned out to be so successful that in the modern-day Warhammer world, there are very few places that have not been graced by the presence of the greenskins. However, there are still a few manly men left amongst the green-skinned races, because savage orcs do still exist, in pretty much the same way that they have always existed, although they have made some developments since the early days. One of them, a major breakthrough in weapons technology, for example, is the Big Stabber. I love this weapon. It is precisely what it looks like. It is a ram-sized spear used to hunt the largest and toothiest of creatures that roam the jungle, since the Orcs eventually got sick of simply just getting splattered and developed countermeasures. It took them a few millennia, but eventually they solved the mystery of mounting an even larger, even sharper rock on an even larger implement. And there are even some tribes that have become more of a conglomeration of savage orcs and normal orcs, living together in as close to peace and harmony as orcs will ever get within spitting distance of one another. Though most of the truly savage tribes still dwell deep within the jungle, mostly isolated from the rest of orc kin. But the major tribes, the ones that have moved on from the old nomadic lifestyle of the savage orcs, can be found around the Southland still, travelling the large rivers or the outlying areas, waging war against, anyone silly enough to get close, and also launching repeated raids into the surrounding area, often into the old cities of Nehekhara, many of which are still populated by humans who produce all manners of wonderful things that the savage orcs find oh so intriguing. And of course, it's always good sport running into a few skeletons as well. Sadly, they lack the visceral splitchy and splushy effect of hitting something else that, is still living and breathing and circulating blood, but they crunch nicely, so it's not too bad. And indeed, the very existence of these raiding targets is one of the reasons why some of the tribes, like for example the bone clubs or the snakeskins, can actually continue a little bit more of a fixed existence, whilst many of the other tribes still, as mentioned, maintain a nomadic lifestyle. They have to either follow the prey animals, or on occasion, move out of the paths of the larger predators, who also have their own territories to establish and fight over. If a particularly vicious Carnosaurus moves into the neighborhood, the local orc tribe may have no other option than to relocate at the very least temporarily. And many bands also leave their tribes to seek their fortune in the wider world as, de facto mercenaries in a way, or simply just nomadic wandering tribes, joining up in temporary organizations with other green-skinned tribes of the wider world, forming alliances of a sort where the two parties lend each other their strengths. This is why you can see savage orcs even in the tribes raiding into the Empire, for example. Although there is still a great deal of difference between the two. The more civilized orcs view the savages as, well, just that, savage ferals from the deep south. They are considered ignorant, even, by orc standards. On the other hand, the savage orcs view the civilized orcs as weaklings, as those who have deviated from the path of Gork and Mork, for surely the gods placed the greenskin on this wonderful, lively world filled with things to smush, to do just that in their natural forms. And any additional enhancements as, well, surely that is cheating, right? There are even those orcs that belong to the civilized groups that convert for de facto religious reasons, believing that the old ways are the best ways. And surely there are also those amongst the savage orcs who encounter the larger, more organized metalworking tribes for the first time and figure, you know what? No, I can see the value in wearing armor. I've had too many arrows sticking out of my knees and pecs to not see the advantages there, thank you very much. Because, you see, the savage orcs do not use armor pretty much at all. Now, you could argue that thick enough furs could provide a degree of protection, and some will use shields, for example. But actual proper armor is very rare, if indeed existent at all. Instead, the savage orcs put their faith in a rather more esoterical form of protection, namely a ritualistic war paint. This usually blue or reddish dye is meant to bring down the protection of Gork and Mork and shield the orc from harm. As to its effectiveness, well, it varies to a rather considerable degree, but remember, this is of course a magical world in which chaos responds to the beliefs, the intentions, and rituals of the various sentient species. If an orc shaman paints a spiral pattern in a particular form, and he does that again and again and again and again, believing it to impart protective benefits onto the orc that it is painted upon, then eventually, over the course of, well, God only knows how long, it actually will provide that orc with a degree of protection. Again, all magic is essentially a kind of programmed ritual. Certain words, certain incantations, certain runic inscriptions, or certain materials all combine to create a formula that the caster then believes will produce the sought-after effect. And therefore, war paint, just like any other form of ritual, can be effective. Of course, you won't know whether or not it'll actually work out for you until something has hit you. At which point it'll be far too late to start questioning the validity of the shroomed out of his mind witch doctor that guaranteed you that no, this war paint is absolutely worth the teeth you're paying for it. Money back guaranteed. Assuming you live long enough to claim, of course. And even if you do, well, shamans have a rather exalted position within savage orc society, and not undeservedly so either, as they do possess real power, and could turn an orc who happens to be unsatisfied with the services into a gnarling, barking little squig toad, for example. That's sure to keep the other orky-borkies in line, whether they're happy with the paint job or not. There are, of course, also war chiefs, biguns, and bosses in Savage Orc society as well, and they hold a great deal of power. As always, within the Orc worldview, might makes right. And if you can crump a shaman, well, he simply didn't have the favour of Gork and Mork, now did he? But the Savage Orcs are a fair bit more spiritualistic than the more, again, civilised versions. They live far simpler lives, more in tune with the wishes of their twin deities, Gork and Mork. Indeed, it is even considered quite charming by some of the, again, civilized orcs, and many, as mentioned, do convert. There are even tales of other creatures joining up with savage orc tribes, such as trolls or even giants. There is one particularly amusing little story that I won't get too much into here, where a giant was adopted by a tribe of savage orcs who viewed him as an avatar of Gork and Mork. And whether he was Gork or whether he was Mork, well, that was a topic open to considerable discussion and debates, usually using clubs. And even the giant himself, of course, didn't know. One day he was the one thing, the other he was the other thing. Cunningly brutal and brutally cunning. Another creature, too, by the by, that gets along famously with the savage orcs is the wild boar. Yes, indeed. Why precisely the savage orcs and massive boars, often bred by the orcs for war, mind you, for extra size and viciousness, is a matter of some contention. Personally, I maintain that a savage orc and a war boar are just about precisely as pig-headed as the other as to instill respect in one another. Let me put it like this. If a war boar and a savage orc happen to come across one another on a narrow jungle path, and there was no way to get off the path, do you think either one of them would let the other go? No, I don't think so either. And I therefore posit that after the two have been staring at one another for minutes, hours, days, weeks, food and water permitting, is it then not possible, nay, eminently probable, that both sides develop a form of grudging respect for one another, and so ride off into the sunset as fast friends? I like to believe so. And on that note, stay put next month for a 35-minute video on the war boar. Maybe. But that is all I've got on the savage orcs of the Southlands. Although, to be fair, they can be found many, many more places than just the Southlands these days. Until next time, I have been Arch. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and sharing the video around because, well, that's just how the YouTube algorithm works these days. And until next time, have a good day.